Hey Joe, it's Fab here. Instagram user J&D Custom Company out of India reached out to me and just asked if I would share some information as far as metal finishing. And I told him I'd just put together a little video to show some basic techniques that I use as far as what I do for metal finishing. And by no means are the things that I'm going to share the only way to do metal finishing, nor are they necessarily the right way or the wrong way to do metal finishing. It's just the techniques that I use. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to use an aluminum dish that was shaped on the stump with mallet and shot bag techniques to do shrinking and stretching, and then I took it to my planishing hammer just to try to make the shape more uniform. And the planishing hammer, I didn't spend a lot of time on it, just to leave kind of more of a rough, inconsistent surface, so that there's more metal finishing to be done, and just so that we'll be able to see some a little more instant gratification, or be able to see the highs and lows and the results of the metal finishing a little bit easier. The way I do it is I'll take this dish and I'll spray it with blue layout fluid or dicum. So that's the first thing I'll do, is I'll spray this dish down, and then we'll hit it with a file to start seeing our highs and lows, and then we'll start doing some metal finishing and share a couple techniques based on what the piece tells us, as far as what we've got to do to straighten out the surface, smooth out the surface, and make it as smooth as possible. So here we go.
Okay, here the dish has been sprayed with the layout fluid. Its purpose is a lot like using a guide coat when you're doing body work. It's just going to give us a contrast in color when we start to file and sand on this dish. It's not a real heavy coat. It's just enough so we'll be able to see a visible difference. And so the first thing that we'll do is I'll get a file, and we'll hit that with a file to see all the highs and lows. Okay, our first step here, I'm going to take, and I'm basically going to look at this dish in half here and try to work on both sides a little bit differently, just maybe to show some different techniques and what kind of results they get. So on this first side, I'm going to use this file, not necessarily to remove material, but to start bringing out some of the highs and lows. And that's just a quick wash over there to show the highs and lows that we've got. I'm also going to do the same thing. I've got a 80 grit sandpaper on a sanding block here. Again, it glances off the high spots and leaves the blue layout fluid on the low spots. For this dish, the shape is pretty consistent. I think I'm going to forego using the file side and just stick with the 80 grit sandpaper. It looked like it worked the best on this shape. So I'm going to finish knocking the whole thing down with the sanding block. Just think it's going to work better on this shape. There we can see every spot that there's basically blue layout fluid left, that's a low spot. And everywhere that sanding has taken us down to metal, that's a high spot. So the surface at a glance looked fairly smooth, but now that we look at it, we can see that it's very, very inconsistent. A lot of highs and lows. For the purposes of this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate in a quarter of this dish to how I would do the metal finishing to smooth it all out and make it more consistent, rather than spending all my time on the whole dish. We'll just work in this 1/4 of the dish. Do some more sanding. And with the sanding process, you know, we are going to be removing material which will be taking down some of the high spots. If we were doing a project that we planned on having a polished finish, the polishing process itself removes material, so we'd want to consider using a thicker material, thicker aluminum for a project like that, because we're going to want to get it as smooth as possible so that it has a mirror finish when we've polished. This is just 1/16 inch thick aluminum, but for this purpose, we're going to do some sanding, do some filing, and do some planishing with the hammers and the shop bags here. But we shouldn't get too thin for the instruction purposes here. But I'm going to keep sanding for a little bit. All right, after a bit of sanding, we can see I've taken down a lot of the high spots to the point that there's not a whole lot of blue layout fluid that's still visible. I can still see, like here, I don't know if you can see that on the camera or not, but I can see the remains of some blue layout fluid there, and that's a low spot. So we're going to want to work on that little low spot right there. And to do that, the method that I use, you know, using sandbags, is really pretty simple. I'll take a body hammer that's got a face that, you know, somewhat matches the inside profile of this dish, and I'll look at where that low spot is located, and I'll just lightly tap on the inside of the surface here. I'm not going to do a lot of work there because I don't want to push it out too far. I just want to bring it to the level of the rest of the dish. And this method that I'm using isn't all that unsimilar from using a dolly and a slapper or using a bullseye pick. We're still basically doing the same thing, where we're just trying to bring that low spot up to match the rest of the surface. And I can see along the edge here, I've got quite a bit of low spots, and some concentrated in this area here. So I'll work on that a little bit. come back to sanding again. And it's almost one at a time, bringing those little low spots out. So I'm going to keep working on this area right here, bring out a bunch of these lows, and we'll come back after I get those all out. Okay, that looks pretty good as far as having gotten this all smoothed out and any little low spots are gone. I can kind of see in the video here that the sanding several different directions has kind of created a crosshatch, and the way that the light bounces off of that, it kind of looks like there might still be low spots in there, but I'm pretty happy with what I've got here. If there's low spots, I could really feel them at this point. I mean, it's nothing like what we've got here on this side. This is really pretty well metal finished. This is just with 80 grit sandpaper. Now, depending on what the end product was going to be, you know, this finish would be, you know, be fine going to paint, because it's going to have some tooth to it. So if it was going to be painted, you know, then obviously the painter is going to want to scuff the surface anyway to whatever coarseness of sandpaper that they personally like to use. But for the most part, I think a primer would adhere really well to the tooth that we've got there. But on the other hand, if we were going to polish, obviously this is really coarse and is not going to polish very well, and all those scratches are going to still be there. So what we're going to want to do is get the DA sander, which stands for dual action sander, which basically is a pneumatic orbital sander, if you don't know what a DA sander is. So I'll grab my DA and hit this with some 80 grit sandpaper just to make it more of a uniform sanded surface, and then we'll take a couple finer grits of sandpaper and smooth it down even more. Okay, here's my DA with 80 grit sandpaper on it. I'm just gonna work this area a little bit just to make the sand, basically the sanding pattern, a little more uniform. Okay, now this entire quarter here, I hit with the DA and the 80 grit. As far as the part being smooth, it's very smooth at this point. There is a bit of a texture to the aluminum surface just from the coarseness of the sandpaper. So my DA, now I've got a pad with 120 grit sandpaper in it, so I'll hit the whole surface again with the DA with 120. Alright, I've thoroughly sanded this section with the 120 grit sanding paper on the DA, and the surface is super smooth already. Almost has a satin finish to it. If you can see that in the video there. In comparison, stark contrast to where we were when we started the sanding process, where this whole dish is just kind of got this hammered finish to it from being in the planish hammer to where we're at now. Again, now where we're at, kind of where are you going with your part? Is this going to be painted? Is it going to be polished? Is going to determine what we would do next. If this was aluminum or steel part that was going to be painted, you know, more sanding and more metal finishing wouldn't really be necessary, because this is just super smooth. You know, even using some red Scotch Brite is going to soften and smooth this surface even more. And just make it just baby smooth. So I'm really happy with how smooth this part is. If we're going to polish, on the other hand, we'd continue going with finer and finer sandpaper, and then we'd get into thousands of grit sandpaper, and we'd be wet sanding, and then we'd start to polish to really bring the shine out of the metal. But that's a whole nother thing entirely. But as far as doing some metal finishing basics, I hope that was informative. And you can see once again the surface that we started with the contrast of the highs and the lows, with the layout fluid, to where we're at now. Through editing, you know, this video is a little bit shorter than the time that it took me to do this, but all the effort into this section right here, start to finish, you know, I probably have a half hour, 20 minutes to a half hour, I suppose, into just this section as far as metal finishing. So metal finishing isn't a difficult thing to do. It's just takes time. For this part, you know, using the body hammer and a shot bag to back the material was really effective. That isn't always going to be what'll work best for you. Sometimes you're going to have to go with that method of using hammer and a dolly, just because you have to physically get, you know, up inside of a part, whether it's in a fender or inside of a fuel tank or you know, the fender well of a car, you know, if you're doing car work rather opposed to work on a motorcycle fender or motorcycle gas tank. But there you go. Just some real simple basics. Hope that was informative.